be talking about Elijah and how Elijah was sent. So a couple months ago, I went to a Penguins game with some family members, and they were playing the San Jose Sharks, and we were thinking it was a great game to go to. The Penguins were just scoring goal after goal after goal, and with 12 minutes left in the third period, the Penguins were up 5-1. So it's like, yeah, they're going to win for sure. And you know that they're going to win. So it's an exciting time to be in that environment. In fact, it almost got boring, and some of the people left the arena because there was a storm coming and they wanted to get out before the traffic, and they're like, the Pens got this in the bag. There's no way anything other than that could happen. Then the San Jose Sharks score a goal, 5-2. No problem. Still fine, no problem. 6 minutes left, the San Jose Sharks score yet another goal, making it 5-3. 2 minutes left, the Sharks score another goal, 5-4. And with 1 minute left in the period, the San Jose Sharks score another goal, tying the game 5-5. And everyone who was just cheering and celebrating before is now just like, how could this have happened? And then the Sharks score in overtime, and they win the game, and we all walk out of there in utter disappointment. How could we have gone from such a high to now such a low? Just 15 minutes ago, we were celebrating, and now it's a disappointment. It's a loss. So it's one thing for this kind of emotional roller coaster to happen in sports, but it's another thing for that to happen in your personal life. Have you ever been doing something where you're putting all this time and energy into something that should be a victory, that should be a success, but then something happens and it feels like a failure? Where you go from this high to this low, and you feel exhausted, you feel discouraged, and you feel alone. This is exactly what happened to Elijah in 1 Kings. He had this massive victory for Israel. He had achieved one of the most successful victories in all of the Bible, and then something happens in his life where he goes from this high to the lowest point of his life. We're going to take a look at what happens to Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 19. If you have a Bible, you can open to that now, but before we get into that, we're going to talk a little bit about the lead up to that of our story of 1 Kings 16, 17, and 18. So I'm just going to tell the story, and then we're going to get into 1 Kings chapter 19. So our story starts with 4 characters. The first is King Ahab. What you have to know is Ahab was a bad dude. And I don't mean like bad, he was a cool. No, he was a very evil king of Israel. He was more evil than all the other kings of Israel before, and it was specifically because he married the princess of Sidon. Jezebel is our second character, and she is the princess of the Sidonians. And the Sidonians worshipped a different god whose name was Baal. And whenever she married King Ahab started promoting worship of this false god Baal, along with the true God Yahweh and other gods that they had mixed in. Which brings us to our third character, and that is God. God said that King Ahab was worse and more evil than any other king before, and that he aroused the anger of God more than any other king of Israel before because of what he did. And so God responds to King Ahab through our fourth character, and that is Elijah. He tells Elijah to tell Ahab that as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. That is what Elijah tells King Ahab. And it stops raining. Not for 1 year, not for 2 years, but for 3 years it stops raining. Do you know what happens when it stops raining for 3 years? First of all, it's drought. And so the streams dry up. There's really not a source of water to drink that's reliable. But in addition to that, there's no rain. No rain means no crops. And so you don't have 3 years worth of crop harvests. And you have to rely on your existing food sources, which is mostly stored in your animals. And so you have to start slaughtering your animals to keep the food. But then, No rain means no grass. And so even the animals don't have food to eat. And eventually the animals start to die. And you go from drought to famine to a really desperate situation. After 3 years of no rain, it is not looking good for Israel. And eventually God presents himself to Elijah and says, now is the time. Go present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land again. So Elijah goes and presents himself to Ahab. He goes to Ahab's palace, and along the way he meets Obadiah, this guy who is Ahab's palace administrator, who we're told feared God greatly. So this was a righteous person. And whenever Obadiah sees Elijah, he just about falls over. He's like, Elijah, is that you? Is this what my eyes are really telling me, that Elijah, who's been missing for 3 years, is standing in front of me? And Elijah says to Obadiah, I want to talk to Ahab. Can you arrange a meeting for me to talk to King Ahab? And Obadiah's like, whoa, you want me to die? Is that what you're saying? You who have been wandering around the land for 3 years, King Ahab's been looking everywhere for you. You want me to go tell King Ahab that I know where you are after 3 years? You know what's going to happen, Elijah? You're going to just disappear again. And I'm going to come back, and you're not going to be here, and then Ahab's going to kill me. Elijah, don't do that to me. Do you know that I fear God? Do you know that I've feared God since my youth? Do you know, Elijah, that I've been hiding away 100 prophets of God in a cave and giving them food and water and providing for them? Elijah, I'm a good guy. Don't do this to me. And Elijah promises and says, Obadiah, as surely as God lives, I will meet with King Ahab. And so he fulfills his word. He meets with Ahab. And Elijah arranges an epic showdown. He challenges the gods of Baal, or he challenges the prophets of Baal to a showdown on Mount Carmel. So they all gather up for this moment. King Ahab's there, Elijah's there, 450 prophets of Baal come up this mountain, and all of Israel comes up the mountain to see what's going to happen. And so Elijah presents his challenge. He says, this is what we're going to do. Israel, you keep wavering between two opinions. If God is God, you should worship him. If Baal is God, you should worship him. This is how we're going to know who the true God is. Here's an altar where we're going to put an animal on this altar and sacrifice an animal to God, to Yahweh, the true God. And then on the other altar, the 450 prophets of Baal are going to sacrifice an animal to Baal, to their God. But we're not going to light the altars on fire. We're just going to put the animals in the wood on. And whoever's God answers by fire, that's how we know who the true God will be. So the people agree to this arrangement. Whoever's God answers by fire will show who God really is. And the prophets of Baal start shouting out for Baal. They start screaming for him to answer. Baal, please answer us, answer us. And they start dancing around, and they're kind of getting hysterical and into this Baal worship where they're calling out for God to answer them. And they do this all morning, and no one answers. And Elijah's just sitting back. He's not really doing anything. He starts to mock the prophets of Baal. He's like, shout louder, shout louder. Maybe he's thinking. Maybe he's on a business trip. Keep shouting. Maybe he's sleeping. Maybe he's occupied. Who knows? So they keep shouting and shouting, and they actually start cutting themselves with swords, which is apparently something that worshipers of Baal did to get his attention. And they start bleeding all over the place, and they're shouting and dancing in desperation. And this is the scene as they're waiting for Baal to answer, and still no answer. And then Elijah says, it's my turn. And he gathers the people of Israel around. And he has them rebuild the altar that was there, but that King Ahab tore down, the one that was to the true God, Yahweh. So they rebuild that altar, and then he says, take 12 buckets of water and pour it on the altar. Now, I don't know if you've ever made a fire like at a campsite, but I typically don't say, pour 12 buckets of water on before I try to start that fire. That's because if you have all that water on, it's obviously very hard for that wood to catch on fire. But the second thing that you have to note is this is during a drought. And so 12 buckets of water is a very precious resource that to the outside observer looks like they're just wasting pouring on an altar. But Elijah has confidence that his God will answer. So all this happens, and Elijah begins to pray for God to answer. And he prays, "Answer me, Lord, answer me, that these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." And then fire falls down from heaven and consumes the wood. It burns the animal. It burns the stones, and it burns the soil, and all the water evaporates instantaneously. And all the people see this, and they fall down, and they start worshiping God, and they say, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." And in this dramatic moment, this frenzied state, Elijah has them grab all the 450 prophets of Baal, and right then they slaughter the prophets of Baal, achieving a decisive victory for Israel. What an epic victory and a scene. Which makes what's about to happen all the more surprising. We're going to pick up the story in 1 Kings 19, 1 through 4, and we're going to read the rest of the story here. Verses 1 through 4, chapter 19. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." What just happened? This is a dramatic shift from 4 verses ago, where we see him in this high, and now 4 verses later, he's in the lowest point of his life. He wants to die. Elijah is experiencing what happens to so many of us after pursuing a long and difficult task is burnout. Elijah is burnt out. Now remember what he just went through. For 3 years, he was hiding from Jezebel. He was going from place to place, hiding. People probably hated him because they saw him as responsible for this drought, for this famine. And he is having to live through this drought and famine, being provided for by God this whole time. And then he comes up the mountain, has this dramatic confrontation, which was successful, but I'm sure also really draining. And after all of that, someone still wants him dead. And now he has to go back into hiding again, where he doesn't know how long he will be in that situation. And he just says, "I can't do this anymore. God, I've had enough. I'm done. I'm done." Have you ever felt like Elijah? Have you ever felt burnt out? Maybe there's a situation in your job, or maybe there's a relationship that you have a certain role in. Maybe it's in your marriage or in parenting or some other relationship. Maybe it's in ministry, or maybe it's in something else. But whatever it is, I think we've all had situations where we're putting all our energy towards something that we think should be a victory, and then something happens and it triggers us, and we just say, "God, I can't do this anymore." We might know what we're supposed to do. We might even be good at that thing, but we just can't bring ourselves to do it. That is called burnout. And it's what Elijah was experiencing. But, spoiler, God's not done with Elijah. He restores him in this feeling of burnout. And that's the main focus of this sermon today, that God restores us even when we are feeling burnt out. I have 3 points that we're going to specifically look at. 1, God restores us when we're feeling exhausted through his provision. 2, God restores us when we're feeling discouraged through his patience. And 3, God restores us when we're feeling alone through his people, specifically through other people. So let's look at God restoring us through his provision when we're feeling exhausted. We see in verse 5, "Then he lay down," that's Elijah, "under the bush and fell asleep. All at once an angel touched him and said, 'Get up and eat.' And he looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. So who put the food there? I don't know. Maybe it was Obadiah. He was known for feeding hungry prophets in the wilderness. Or probably it was just the angel who put the food there. Elijah was hungry and he was tired, and God said, here's some food, take a nap. And then in verse 7, the angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. So he got up and ate and drank. And strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. And then he went into a cave and spent the night. So again, more eating and more sleeping. God knows we have physical needs. God knew that Elijah was hungry and he was tired. And he needed to care for those physical needs before he could get to the root of the issue. A few weeks ago, my wife and I had a little dispute. I don't know if you've ever been to IKEA, but the problem was that we chose to go to IKEA at 5:30 p.m. on a Saturday night, and we hadn't eaten any dinner with a toddler. So we go to IKEA, and I don't know if you've ever been there before, but it's this really pleasurable browsing experience. You kind of like meander through. You look at the different setups. You're like, oh, that's nice, that's nice. And it's really pretty enjoyable until you want to leave. And then it feels like a prison. You're like, how do I get out of here? And after having been there for an hour and a half with a toddler, it was 7 p.m., we hadn't eaten anything, and all of us were hangry, and we just wanted to escape. So yes, my wife and I argued on how best to escape in IKEA. We finally did get out, and when we did, we ate some food, and we all felt much better after that. And we were able to address the conflict after eating. But here's the thing. In that moment, we wouldn't have been able to address it. We were too hungry, and we needed to care for those needs first. So the application here is actually really easy. Sometimes you just need to eat a snack and take a nap. Sometimes you just need to eat and sleep. Sometimes when you're in the midst of a difficult situation, you just need to take some time to care for your own needs. God restores us when we're feeling exhausted through his provision. Sometimes, just like Elijah, we can get tunnel vision, and we get so focused on the difficult situation at hand that we actually forget to care for our own needs. And God provides us with the things that we need for those needs. So, eat food and thank God for providing it. Sleep and thank God for providing it. And two things happen. One, you get into a better mindset and you can address those difficult situations better. But two, you realize after disconnecting yourself from the difficult situation and relying on God that God is still providing for you, that life still goes on in burnout and you still have the food and sleep that you need, and God is still caring for you. And it shifts your perspective in a way that I think is important when you're trying to address burnout. So point one is God restores us when we're feeling exhausted through his provision. Now we're going to look at point two. God restores us when we're feeling discouraged through his patience. So remember, in verse 7, we saw that God told Elijah to go on a journey. And then in verse 8, he goes to Mount Horeb. And this is the same mountain where Moses saw the burning bush. It's also the same mountain where God gave Moses the 10 Commandments. And so Elijah knows in his mind, Moses saw God here. I'm going to go to Mount Horeb, the same place that Moses met God. And then he went into a cave and spent the night. In verse 9, we read that the word of the Lord came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah, why are you here? Why are you here? Which is an interesting question because it kind of makes it seem like God actually didn't send Elijah there. If God's asking, why are you here? It seems like Elijah chose to go to Horeb himself. So we have to ask, why at this moment did Elijah feel like he needed to go to talk to God? He knew this was the mountain that Moses talked to God. So why did Elijah feel like he needed to talk to God at this moment? And in verse 10, we get his answer to this question. Verse 10, we read, he replied, "I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and they are trying to kill me too." So basically he's saying, God, everyone's against you. No one is for you except for me. I'm the only one left. I'm the only one who's doing what's right. I'm the only one who's standing up for your name. Can you imagine now what it's like to feel that kind of burden? Can you understand now why Elijah was feeling burnt out? He was carrying this enormous weight of this prophetic role, and he felt like he was the only one that cared. But we need to take a hard look at these statements. We need to evaluate the truth in what Elijah believes about the situation. Let's take a look at the exact things that he said in verse 10. First, he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. True, yeah, that's accurate. Elijah is a very zealous person. Next thing he says is, the Israelites have rejected your covenant. Actually, that's not true. Actually, the words that we last heard the Israelites say were, the Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. That's not rejecting your covenant. They have tore down your altars. Yes, the altar was tore down, but Elijah just rebuilt that altar. They put your prophets to death with the sword. Sure, Jezebel did put the prophets of the Lord to death with the sword. But more recently, Elijah put to death the prophets of Baal with the sword. And the next statement is the real kicker. Elijah says, I'm the only one left. This is ironic. Elijah is currently a prophet of the Lord. He's currently on the run from Jezebel, who wants to murder him. He's currently hiding in a cave, being provided with food and water. Do you remember that guy Obadiah that Elijah met, that Elijah talked to before he met Ahab? Let's read exactly what Obadiah told Elijah in 1 Kings 18:13. Obadiah says to him, haven't you heard, my lord, what I did while Jezebel was killing the prophets of the Lord? I hid 100 of the Lord's prophets in 2 caves, 50 in each, and supplied them with food and water. Elijah was told by Obadiah specifically that there were 100 more people, 100 more prophets of the Lord doing the exact same thing that Elijah was doing right now. And yet, despite being told that verbatim, Elijah thought, I'm the only one. I'm the only one left. Now, I don't think Elijah's lying. I think he just has a distorted version of reality. He's so blinded by his situation that he has a warped view of reality. This lasting fear from Jezebel is causing him to have a distorted view. And this is actually an honest picture of what burnout looks like. When we get to the point of burnout, it can so shape our sense of what is real that we are blind to the situation. We don't see what others see from the outside. But notice what God does next. He doesn't scold him, he doesn't condemn him, and he doesn't even say that he's mad. He shows up with gentle patience. Let's look at verse 11, where he shows up in this famous way. The Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. And then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after a fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the foot of the mountain. Elijah was a dramatic man. He was used to the flashy, powerful ways that God showed up. He stopped rain for 3 years. He brought someone back to life. He made fire rain down from heaven. He had storm clouds roll in whenever he finally proved God's truth. But in this quiet moment, God was speaking to Elijah in a different way. He was speaking to him in a still, small voice. These words, still, small voice, mean a sound that's almost imperceptible. It's like those moments where it's so quiet that you actually hear something, that you hear ringing in your ears because of how quiet it is. This is the kind of way that God showed up to Elijah in that moment. And in this quiet moment, in this still small place, God whispers to Elijah, Elijah, why are you here? Why are you here? It's the same question as before. And then Elijah gives the exact same answer as before. So you have to ask yourself, why did God do this? Why did he go through all this trouble? If he knew Elijah was just going to answer the exact same way, why did he do this? In fact, why didn't he just set him straight under that broom tree at the beginning of the story when he was first feeling this way? Why didn't he just correct his distortion at that point? And the only answer that I can give is that God is more patient than we are. He let Elijah have this moment where he prayed to God, and then he let him wander in the wilderness for 40 days and come up the mountain of the Lord and then ask God this question and answer God and then hear this still small voice. And then God asks him again and Elijah answers a second time. And he lets him do all this knowing that the distortion is still there at the end as it was from the beginning. But he lets him do all of this for his own personal growth. His own personal growth, he lets him wrestle this whole time in the wilderness. I think God allows us that time and is more patient than we are for our own growth. Before being the youth pastor here at Northgate, I was a youth pastor of a church in Chicago. And I really enjoyed ministering to the students there in Chicago during that time. But at the end of my time there were some things that were going on in our church that made it difficult for me to continue to minister there. And so when our son was born, and my wife and I and our son moved back to Pittsburgh, I purposely decided not to take another ministry position because I was feeling like Elijah. I was feeling burnt out. I was saying to God, I can't do this anymore. I'm done. And in those moments, I would go outside late at night and I would walk around my neighborhood and I would pray and I would listen to scripture. And in those quiet moments when I was with God, something starts to happen when you pray in those moments enough. I'm sure my prayers were distorted. I'm sure I did not have a correct view of reality. I probably prayed things at times and God was like, I don't know how you came to that conclusion. That's definitely not true. But he didn't come to me in a windstorm. He didn't really come to me in some dramatic, powerful way. He was just patient. He sort of just let me say it. He sort of just let me pray all these things. And when you do that for a long enough period of time, you start to realize your own distortions. You start to realize the own ways that your reality is warped, and it kind of grounds you. And you come to a point where you can come out of that fog and you can understand the truth that God knew for you from the beginning. God restores us from feeling discouraged through his patience. If you're feeling discouraged, go to God. Run to him, don't run away from him, and he will show up to you. And I'm not saying he's going to answer you in some like powerful windstorm way, some moment, because in the story, he doesn't. He doesn't send someone to Elijah to rebuke him or correct him. He doesn't show up to him in this powerful response. Instead, he responds with patience. But he's patient enough to give us the time that we need until we're ready for the truth that he had from us from the very beginning. So, point number one is when we're feeling exhausted, God restores us with his provision. When we're feeling discouraged, God restores us with his patience. And point number three is when we're feeling alone, God restores us with other people. That's what we're going to look at next. So now that God has been patient with Elijah, he's ready to correct that distortion. Now, if you read this whole story from the beginning, you'll see that one of the biggest things that's contributing to Elijah's burnout time after time is that he truly feels like he was sent alone. He feels like he was sent on a mission and he is the only one. And he can't seem to get this thought out of his mind, even when he's explicitly told the opposite. Starting in verse 15, we see God reply to Elijah and correct this distortion. Verse 15, the Lord said to him, "Go back the way you came, go to the desert of Damascus. And when you get there, anoint Hazael king of Aram. Also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king of Israel. And anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel Meholah, to succeed you as prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. Yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and whose mouths have not kissed him. So now, finally, God tells him the truth. He says, you think you were sent alone. You're not alone. And there's not just 100 prophets, but there's 7,000 people that I have reserved who have been worshiping me, who have not bowed down to Baal, and whose mouths have not kissed him. God restores us when we're feeling alone through other people. Elijah needed to be put in his place. He needed God to say, Elijah, you're not the only one serving me. There's other people that can do what you're going to do. And in fact, I'm going to go and send you to anoint some of these other people to do this. I'm going to send you to anoint new kings. But also, I'm going to send you to anoint your own replacement. You're going to be replaced by this guy, Elisha, and he's going to do the same thing that you've been doing. And in addition to that, there are 7,000 other people who have continued to worship me. Elijah, you are not sent alone. See, Elijah had forgotten this key truth. He had forgotten that God doesn't depend on Elijah. Elijah needs to depend upon God. I think this is an important message for us to hear because we can often start to believe in those situations of burnout that I'm the only one that can fix this problem. I'm the only one that can repair this relationship. And this just isn't true. There are other people that can do the same thing that we can do. And this is really healthy for us to know. Because if we think we're the only ones who are responsible, it's definitely going to lead to burnout. If we're carrying that burden and we think that we're the only ones that can carry that burden, then it's going to be really hard to be restored. Restoration comes when you realize that God is in control and we are not so much in control. God is the one who's powerful over the situation, not so much us. So that's the first thing God does. He corrects this distortion that Elijah is the only one. And then the second thing that this statement here does is that God pairs Elijah with his apprentice Elisha. And this is exactly what Elijah needed. He needed someone to stick with him until the very end. Elisha was by Elijah's side literally until the very end. He stuck by his side until Elijah rose up to heaven, until the moment that Elijah was taken. So in Elijah's greatest moment of need, God gave him a companion that would be with him for the rest of his life. I think if we're honest, there's a lot of temptation to be like Elijah. There's a lot of temptation to think of ourselves as the Lone Ranger, that we're the last one standing. I think it's baked into our American culture, this theme of rugged individualism, where we want to be the Lone Ranger. A word from the famous character of the Lone Ranger, the Texas character, he was said to be the sole survivor of a group of 6 ambushed Texas Rangers. The Lone Ranger was the last one left to promote justice in the West. But was he really alone? Even in the story of the Lone Ranger, he had a traveling companion named Tonto. And if it wasn't for Tonto there being the Lone Ranger's Kimosabe, I don't think the Lone Ranger would have been successful. Even the Lone Ranger needed someone to stick by his side. So, who do you need to stick by your side? Who do you need to be your companion? Or, a better way to phrase it is, whose side do you need to stick by? Because someone you know might be feeling like Elijah right now and could really use your company and support. And you can be the solution to someone else's discouragement. You can be the person to stick by their side. In conclusion, God restores us when we're feeling burnt out, and he restores us when we're feeling exhausted through his provision, when we're feeling discouraged through his patience, and when we're feeling like we were sent alone through other people. I think it's noteworthy that through this entire story, God doesn't condemn Elijah in any way. He doesn't say Elijah did something wrong for feeling burnt out. He didn't. Instead, he comes to him and gives him what he needs and restores him. But God doesn't write him off either. In fact, he does the opposite. He steps into Elijah's life and he gives him a further mission to accomplish. God knows that we all have limits. The thing that's important is for us to recognize our own limits. And when we realize our own limits and when we realize that we're burnt out, part of the restoration is to realize that we do indeed have a limit and that we are actually not sent alone. We are actually dependent upon God and we need other people. Let's pray.